Okay, welcome back to day 2. We've had a chance to examine what it means to study with purpose, putting God first when we're looking in the text and addressing things from the perspective of how we think before the perspective of how we feel. And then we looked at the issue of gaining perspective on a book, framing the book up within the context in which it is written, and then also about dealing with the text in a way that is patient, that we're going to read repetitively and we're going to take a slow approach to mining what is in the text instead of asking for an instant fix. And so today what we're going to do is begin to look at how to study with process. And when we look at a good process for tackling any text, what we want to do is work through 3 different stages of understanding. And the first is comprehension, which is asking, what does the text say? And then the second is interpretation, which is asking, what does the text mean? And then last would be application, which is asking, how should it change me? What should I do differently in light of what I've read here? So today we're going to look specifically at that first one, at comprehension. I find that when it comes to studying the Bible, this is the step that is moved past the quickest for most people. And comprehension is where we have deferred sort of to the experts when we want to ask what the text says, but it's the most basic level of understanding that we need to have. So that means that at this point, in order to break ourselves out of the habit of always asking the experts for the answers, we're going to take that study Bible that was so useful to us when we were reading the envelope, and we're going to put it away for a little while. We're just going to put it away. We're going to put away any other commentaries, anything that someone said about the Bible, or this particular section of the Bible. I want you to not look at it yet. So that means don't listen to podcasts about it, don't listen to sermons about it, and don't even check the study notes in your trusty study Bible. There's really good content in all of those places, but we won't be able to filter it properly until we've spent time in the text ourselves first. So when we look at wanting to achieve comprehension, just knowing what the text says, what I'm basically wanting to get to is a place where if I were to take a pop quiz over the text, I would be able to answer some basic factual questions about it. So for example, based on the material we covered yesterday, if I were to have a pop quiz over who James was, I should be able to answer that he is the brother of Christ, but also that he considered himself a bondservant of Christ, and that he was not someone who would have placed himself on an equal level with the person who he shared a childhood home with. And if I were to ask who's the dispersion, I should be able to answer that question. And so today what I want us to do is begin looking at some of the tools that we typically put into practice to achieve comprehension. And what I've done is I've just listed some of them here over to the side in my notebook so that I can have them top of mind as I'm walking through the first 12 verses of James today. Now, why would I work through the first 12 verses? Well, that's because when I was looking in the introduction to the study Bible, I saw that that's the first logical break in James's thinking. Now, over time, you might start developing your own sense of an outline for the book of James, but when you're starting out, it really is okay to defer to someone else's up front. So just looking at the first 12 verses, what I want to be doing is considering what attributes of God am I seeing in the text? So what am I learning is true about God? What words might I want to look up in the dictionary and sort of reframe my understanding of? And when you're looking up words in the dictionary, there's 2 ways you can think about it. It could be a word that you just actually don't know a definition for, but more often than not, it's a word that you're overly familiar with and you need to sort of freshen up or re-enliven your understanding of what the word means. So something like righteousness might be something that you need to look up and think about what are some synonyms, what are some definitions that would fit within the context. Also transition words, words like if, then, because, but, therefore. These are words that show us that a train of thinking has shifted in the text, and we should think about marking those in a specific way. Also, what questions do I have? When you're walking through a text, you're going to have questions that jump out to you, and then your temptation is to run immediately to find an answer in a secondary source. But what I'm asking you to do at the comprehension stage is just note, I have a question about this, and let it sit there for a little while. Let yourself feel the extent of what you don't yet know. There will be answers for those questions, but at this stage, we're not hurrying to answer them, although some answers might emerge even at this stage. And then lastly, where is a verse that I might want to check in another translation because it seems a little clunky or hard to follow in this particular translation? So let's just take a look and see what we can pull from these first 12 verses. We've already covered verse 1, and you'll see I left some notes on here from what we talked about yesterday that I just would want to remember when I look back at the text, that James says he is a servant of God versus a brother, that he says that Jesus is the Lord Jesus Christ versus just Jesus. Any observation you want, you are welcome to write in here that will be helpful to you. You're allowed to write wrong things. You're allowed to cross things out. This is a stage for learning. It is not a place for you to have some perfectly crafted, artistic and beautiful illumination of the text. This is you being a student. So you may remember too that I mentioned yesterday that there were 54 imperatives, commands that are given in the text. So the first thing I'm going to do as I go through these 12 verses is just see how many of those I can find. And I'm going to mark them with an orange highlighter because I really want them to stand out. So there's one right off the bat. Count it all joy, my brothers. So I'll mark that one. When you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Okay, well, before I can mark some more in orange, I've got some questions that have popped up here. Because it says, when you meet trials of various kinds. Okay, well, that makes sense to me because I know that he's addressing people who are being persecuted. So he's coming right out of the gate, addressing them as family and addressing a primary concern for them. It says that you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Okay, steadfastness, that's a word I think I want to look up. So I'm just going to write steadfast over here. And I'll look it up in just a minute. There it is repeated again. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now, if you've read through the whole letter of James, which I would expect you would have a few times at this point, you know that this theme of steadfastness is going to come up in more than one place. And it's apparently something that is going to have a yield for us. It's going to make us perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. I don't know about you, but that would be a question for me. How can I be perfect and complete? I mean, how can any human be perfect? How can I be lacking in nothing? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me initially, so I'm going to come back to that. Then he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. There's another one of those imperatives. Let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. Wait, did you see that an attribute of God just emerged from the text there? What was it? Generously. So in fact, what I think I'm going to do, and look, I'm going to change pens right midstream, and it's not even going to bother me because it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to help me learn. So generously. So what have I seen to be true about God? He is generous. He gives generously to all without reproach, and it says it will be given to him. And then here's another imperative, but let him ask in faith. So let's highlight another one. Without doubting, for the man who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord, for he is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Now, this phrase double-minded man is an interesting one because since we will have read through the book already a few times, we know that there are actually some other pairs that are going to show up. James enjoys pairing things. He's going to talk about two kinds of wisdom. He's going to talk about two kinds of speech, two kinds of prayer. And so you might want to just keep track of the doubles as you go through, and you might mark them in some special way, like 2x, 2 times. Double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. Okay, well, I had said that he talks about brothers and sisters a whole lot, so now I'm just going to make sure that I capture each mention of that. So there was a brothers up here in verse 2, and here's another brother mentioned down here. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich, we have an implied brother here, so I'm just going to go ahead and mark it as though it's there. The rich brother in his humiliation. And did you catch that? There's another imperative. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and let the rich in his humiliation. Because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Well, there's a lot that I could probably think about in here, but just initially, I'm looking at it and I'm not really understanding what he means when he says, Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation. I think that is something that I'd like to look up in a different translation and see if I can clarify his meaning. So I'm going to come back to that. I'm just going to write a little question mark out here so that I can come back and look at it in just a minute. So he's giving us a contrast there between the rich and the poor, which is also something that he's going to continue throughout the book. So you might write over here, rich and poor, so that when you see it again later on, you can write the same thing out in the margin, and you end up being able to flip through this and have sort of a visual representation of the structure of the letter in a way that can be really helpful to understanding his arguments. Then down in verse 12, he says, "Blessed is the man who remains," there's that word again, "steadfast under trial." You know what? I've seen steadfast so many times that I'm going to choose a color to mark it in. And what I'll do sometimes to make it more visually prominent is I make the first letter a capital, like this. "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Now, I said this was the logical end of the thought, the first thought that James has in the letter, and so I usually mark them like this. I put a little slash there. Sometimes they occur at natural breaks, and sometimes they don't, so you can keep an eye on that when you're looking at an outline of the book. So the attribute of God that I saw come out of these first few verses was that God is generous. But there might be a few other things here as well that we can pull out when we start to look a little closer. So I might now look up the word steadfast and see if I learn anything that helps with my understanding. So I get my phone out and I'm going to go to an online dictionary and put in the word steadfast, and it says firmly fixed in place or immovable. It also says not subject to change. And then another definition for it is firm in belief, determination, or adherence. And so based on the context here, I might come up with a synonym for the word steadfast, or just write out a definition like firm in belief. I think that's kind of a nice place to start. But let's go back up to verse 2 and see if we can gain a little bit more insight into this phrase, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Because that can be a pretty upsetting verse to people who are in the middle of a trial and they're thinking, you want me to just put on a happy face in the middle of all of this? So let's look at some other translations of that one. So what you might do is just go to any Bible app online and you can type in the verse that you want to look at, and then you can compare it across different translations. So here's James 1:2 in the New International Version. It says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds." The New Living Translation says, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." So that's kind of a helpful nuance there. Christian Standard says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials." So by comparing these different translations, you begin to see that what James's point is not that you should feel joy in the moment, but that you should see that trials are going to be ultimately for our good, and that can be a source of joy, that nothing is lost. So we notice that they bring about steadfastness. Now, steadfastness is an attribute that I can take on, but who else is it an attribute for? It's an attribute for God. God is steadfast toward us. So I'm going to take my pink pen and I'm going to note that steadfast is another attribute of God. So I've got a couple questions that I want to look at. I want to try to understand how the lowly brother might boast in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation, but I'm going to save that for when I start thinking about interpretation. And then I also have some things that I've marked that are things that I'm just observing and trying to get under my skin. And these attributes of God, that He is steadfast and that He's generous, these are things that I can meditate on and rejoice in, and then ask, how might I grow to be more like God in my relationships? But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the application part. So that's it for day 2. Hope these are some helps for you as you start to get closer to the text, and we'll come back tomorrow and start looking at interpretation.